Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our Mission Capability Area session on networks, 5G, cyber operations, and cybersecurity. We have the distinct honor of closing out this year's AFA convention. So I hope you guys brought your energy and your great questions today. I'm Brigadier General Rob Lyman. I'm the Assistant Deputy Chief of Staff for Cyber Effects Operations at Headquarters Air Force in the A26, and I'll introduce our panel members here in a second. So we got together and recognizing that's a pretty broad area to cover, we thought through a problem statement we wanted to discuss today, at least to start us out, and we're looking forward to your questions as well. So the problem statement we came up with that we'll discuss today proposes that anticipatory, resilient networking and cyber effects capabilities enabling ABMS and CJADC2 are needed to meet the requirements of the Air Force's core missions in fulfilling the interim national security strategy. We're also in a very challenging budgetary environment. And so we've heard a lot about JADC2 and ABMS, Agile Combat Employment, so today we'll focus in on some of the supporting capabilities for that. So today I'm joined by a great team of industry and academia leaders to discuss all this and more. So let me introduce our panel for today. First off, Dan Rice, Vice President, 5G.MIL Programs at Lockheed Martin. Colonel Lance Spencer, U.S. Air Force retired, Client Executive Vice President at AT&T Global Public Sector. Ed Vasco, Director of Boise State University's Institute of Pervasive Cybersecurity. And Steve Marker, Vice President, Strategy and Business Development, Cyber Systems at General Dynamics Mission Systems. So if you've read Chief Brown's Accelerate, Change, or Lose paper, then you know that over the last several decades, we've benefited from having a competitive advantage over adversaries, and we are now at risk of losing that edge in great power competition if we don't change now and fast. The Air Force's envisioned future includes an acceleration to information warfare and robust capabilities like JADC2 and ABMS, which are key to sense, make sense, and act faster and more effectively than competitors. Information advantage is critical to joint warfare concepts across the spectrum, from competition to conflict. So as the Assistant Deputy Chief of Staff for Cyber Effects Operations, I'm thrilled to be here today with this talented panel. So with that, I'll pose our first question to the panel, and I'll ask that they briefly introduce themselves and respond. And for our audience, if you'd like to submit a question, please text the number on the screens to submit your questions, and we look forward to those. So our first question: what are those things the Air Force could do in partnership with industry and academia to best leverage current capabilities paired with investment in proving and emerging technologies in order to gain the best comparative and competitive advantage possible? And we'll focus on that comparative and competitive advantage. And with that, we'll go straight down the line. So Dan, over to you.
All right, thank you, General Lyman. It's great to be here. I appreciate the opportunity to address this group. I'm Dan Rice. I'm responsible for the 5G.MIL programs at Lockheed Martin. 5G is one of those 21st century technologies that you're hearing a lot about that can be applied to some of the hardest problems in the DOD, the Air Force, the Space Force, et cetera. I think that when you talk about this challenge of how can the Air Force interact and work with academia and industry, there's a number of different places that it can be applied. Within Lockheed Martin, we obviously have strong relationships inside the traditional aerospace and defense industry, but also building new, enduring, and deep relationships with commercial industry to try to bring those technologies to the fore and apply them to the CJADC2 and joint warfighting concept challenges. As I mentioned, one of those areas is 5G. 5G brings a number of capabilities in advanced software-defined networking and so on that can be applied to hard problems in the DoD. Straight commercial technology without modification can be used in a number of different places to address the challenges that we see. But it is not, in an unmodified state, going to be applicable in some of the harder use cases as we get closer to the tactical edge. And I think that's where collaboration between the Air Force, companies like Lockheed Martin, and our commercial partners can be brought forward in order to adapt and enhance those technologies to make them more applicable as we get into these harder and harder use cases. One of those areas that we see enhancements really being required are in the area of cybersecurity. And I think when you look at 5G capabilities just as one example, cyber and the securing of that network is really important. A number of the vulnerabilities that we saw in prior commercial telecommunications networks also exist in 5G, but there's also a number of improvements that if we can build upon, we can make those networks even more to more advantage. So our real objective is to try to find a way to build secure, resilient network of network capabilities that take advantage of these commercial technologies going forward. I'd just like to talk about 3 ways that I think commercial industry can work with the Air Force to help bring these 21st century technologies forward. One is sort of the direct involvement of the traditional contractors that work with the Air Force day in and day out, create with these commercial companies. Working together to develop pilots, co-investments, long-term memorandums of understanding that enable us to work closely, leverage those commercial industry roadmaps into our products and services, and going together to the Air Force and Space Force to demonstrate those capabilities. I think the new Rapid Defense Experimentation Reserve is a great example of how the DOD is interested in bringing these technologies forward. And although I think the 2022 is largely being driven by DOD laboratories, we expect that starting next year, we'll begin to see solicitations that will enable commercial industry to bring ideas forward, to work jointly with the service commands to deliver capabilities going forward. And the last thing I want to talk about is the interaction with the small and medium-sized enterprises. So aerospace and defense companies like Lockheed Martin typically have venture funds that we can apply resources to make equity investments in companies that are developing new and emerging technologies that are very exciting and interesting to our Air Force colleagues. This is an area where, when an aerospace and defense company makes an investment, an equity investment, and has a member on the board of those small companies, all of a sudden you get a lot of interest in how to apply that technology for DoD use. And so we're trying to take advantage of those investments, try to bring and accelerate those new technologies forward by working with them to create applications of that technology into our systems going forward, and demonstrate that working with the Air Force on how they can be applied to these hard challenges. So with that, I'll pass it on to Lance.
Thanks, Dan. So I'll say some very similar things to what Dan said. I have a little bit different perspective on a couple things, but that's okay, because that's how we figure out how to get to the correct end state together. So first of all, I'm a retired Air Force colonel. I've been with AT&T almost 10 years, hard to believe, since my retirement. And I lead the defense business for AT&T. And one thing that I always like to kind of baseline my perspective of what AT&T is at the beginning of a speaking engagement is amongst everything else that AT&T might be, I think of AT&T as an operations company. We operate and deliver capability at scale globally, 24/7, 365. And I can honestly say that if AT&T stops, the world stops, and everything comes to a stop. And so we understand that responsibility. We understand how seriously we have to take that responsibility for our nation, for our world. And we have some unique placement within the government to make sure that very sensitive government missions continue and are delivered, including we provide the airborne communications for Air Force One, and we've been doing that for more than 5 decades. So I think thinking of us as an operations company helps with some of the alignment for some of my other comments. The first thing is to help address the problem statement and the question is budgets are tight. And so I think it's really important that as we're collaborating, the Air Force and Space Force not spend precious capital on problems that are already being solved in the private sector. Focus on problems that are the Air Force or Space Force problems to solve, and maybe how those interfaces or augmentations to the commercial solutions or extensions come together. But honestly, I see contract awards every day, and I very often cringe when I see a major award for something that the solution is on the shelf. and somebody's getting ready to spend a lot of money on it. And if we just figured out how to communicate and talk and collaborate, we could make better use of mutual capital together. The other thing is that make it easier for commercial solutions to be accepted into the Air Force and Space Force. Very often, I see requirements and policy starting literally with a blank sheet. And then it's created from that, sometimes borrowing from commercial standards or other places and pulling it together. But commercial standards and commercial terms and conditions are extremely robust. They're exactly what we use on Wall Street in the financial sector, in hospitals, in other kinds of sectors and arenas. And frankly, you know, when you're dealing with these big companies, they're very concerned about IP rights and data rights and all those other things that are very important to the Air Force and Space Force as well. And they've got really good lawyers to make sure that we are delivering capability that will protect their investment in their IP and their data, and ensure that we're meeting the SLAs that they demand and have pretty high expectations as well. And then the third thing is partnerships really do matter. And I'm talking about the private sector to government, I'm talking about private sector to private sector, and I'm talking about government, private sector, and academia all together. We have a lot of those partnerships already going on. If you look under the hood of AT&T, you will see a lot of companies. You know, we may have the AT&T globe and logo on it, and we're the ones bringing it together, and we're operationalizing it and scaling it and delivering it. But we have incubation environments where we're working with startups, and we evaluate how they might grow and scale, and then we invest in those companies to solve problems like zero trust and some of the other things that are going on that are very important out there right now. We have major alliances with, pick a company, you could probably list a couple and you'd probably be right, where literally we spend billions of dollars together to come up with the partnership and the alliance to deliver a capability. You know, when I was talking about the investment, in the last 5 years, we've invested $110 billion in our network. So that's money that is available to be able to put into partnerships and deliveries and solutions that support the Air Force and Space Force. You know, some of you may be familiar with FirstNet. It's the U.S. government's first responder network. So it's a U.S. government built and delivered by AT&T. It was competitively awarded 25-year public-private partnership. It's an interesting model when you talk about how to share investment, share risk, and provide a capability. I can't get into the specific numbers, but they all end with a B, like in Bravo. And the U.S. government brought capital to the table to build out FirstNet, and AT&T brought a lot more. And you know, the business cases work on both sides. It's an amazing capability for the U.S. government, and it's done under a public-private partnership, which allows us to really open the kimonos together and work through a lot of the things that are important to delivering operational capability. None of this is really new. I sometimes feel like we're reinventing the wheels, but you know, I think back, we've been a defense partner for more than 100 years, pretty much since the beginning of AT&T almost 150 years ago. The first command and control network for general purging in World War I on the front lines of France was delivered by AT&T. We co-invented Autovon and Autodin, and other mainstream solutions have been used by the DOD for years, back in different eras. The strategic automated command and control system was AT&T was behind that. So, you know, bringing that commercial innovation, that commercial investment, and then helping solve Air Force and Space Force problems in partnerships with, you know, other companies that can bring the things to help make it a total solution, I think are vital. So thank you, General Lyman. And
Ed, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks so much. It's great to be here, General Lyman. Thank you so much. Before I get started on my introduction and kind of the key points I wanted to bring up, I did want to take a minute and send a heartfelt thanks and shout out to Colonel Conway Jones, U.S. Air Force retired. He took the time to recognize that academia really hadn't been at the table and pushed for Boise State to be here because of our workforce development efforts and some of our curricula efforts that I'll get to in just a minute. So my thanks to him. If he's here in the room, great. The lights don't allow me to see anybody. And age. So a little bit about myself. So you might look at me and say, well, Boise State, and those of you from the Air Force Academy might go, Boise State. At the end of the day, though, I look like an academic right now, but I've actually spent 30 years of my career in industry, specifically working on the front lines with the civilian sphere. Over that 30-year career, I've started 5 different companies, and my last company, we were actually working directly with AT&T Cybersecurity, so small world, and we're one of their top partners in delivering managed security services out to commercial clients all over the country, all over the world. And in 2018, I had a chance to sell that company. Promised my wife I would not do a 6th startup. I've done 5. And so really looked for the next big challenge. And the next big challenge I see, and where I'm going to focus a lot of my comments and perspective, is on workforce development. One of the largest challenges we have right now across the nation is making certain that the Air Force and all branches of the military, plus the civilian sphere, have the necessary workforce we need to both understand, respond, and defend against our adversaries, both foreign and domestic. And so I want to take a minute because, General Brown, the message around accelerate, change, or lose, I was so pleased to read the paper and so pleased to see that as such a common theme through all the different panels today, because it's really the application of both industry principles being applied here within the Air Force, but then what I really appreciate is, having spent a year in academia, is to see how much academia could also use that same language. Because one of the challenges that we have is, if you want to move slow, go into the government. If you want to move slower, go into academia is typically the approach, right? And one of the things that I've really appreciated, having worked with a significant number of universities and colleges as we were building out our startups over my 30-year career, looking for workforce, was at Boise State, there was a real attempt, and it has been a real attempt, to specifically figure out how we can widen the funnel, how we can change the landscape of our cyber workforce. And I'll get into those specifics in just a minute, because I think that's really at the core of the 3 things I want to talk about. And how can the Air Force, how can commercial industry, how can academia work together? And that is through expanding out the funnel for cyber operations and cybersecurity. All too often, we saw, I'll put on my old former employer hat, we saw that cybersecurity programs were lumped into the computer sciences. And computer sciences typically have a filtering process in place that prevents students from actually going through and becoming cybersecurity specialists. And that filtering is things like advanced math, that we really, when you think about cyber operations, you may not necessarily need. Differential equations, I can assure you, over the 30-year career and having hired thousands of people, that we didn't need advanced calculus or differential equations. So there's a core set of functionalities, core set of capabilities that are needed. And Boise State in particular has taken on the challenge of saying, let's widen this funnel out so that we have a pipeline of potential workers for the entire DFARS workspace. We have a potential line of workers specifically for all of our service branches and for other commercial industry. So I think the first thing is widening the funnel. How can we work together? How can industry, academia, and the Air Force in particular look to widen the funnel out so that we have the ability to utilize these new technologies, these new capabilities with a competent and capable workforce? The second thing that I would want to make certain we all understand and address one of the big elephants in the room. There's 2 as I see it right now. The first one is that while I applaud everything that all of you are doing on a day in and day out basis, I know for a fact that your efforts are externally focused. Our homeland is under attack. Let's recognize that, and it goes directly to the fact that we need more workforce. Our homeland is under attack with Colonial Pipeline being impacted, JBS being impacted. Just today, an agricultural co-op in Iowa had to shut down processing as a result of ransomware. So not only are we seeing these, seeing the direct impacts and direct effect that is impacting each service branch from nation state and from criminal actors, it's impacting our homeland. And so we have to be able to find ways to work together and address that particular elephant in the room. If it's through new technologies, if it's through collaborations, as much as we can possibly find methods and ways to collaborate, let's do so. But ultimately, we have to address that particular elephant, in my opinion. The third point, and this is, I think, the second elephant in the room, may not be as big, but I'll provide maybe a bit of perspective and maybe a bit of a warning around CJADC2. Every single technology transformation platform that I've ever seen and been experienced and been a part of over my 30-year cyber career, every time that we take the data elements and expand them out and find even more and more and more telemetry data to make use of, the challenge that we end up with is that we create more and more data environments and more information environments for our adversaries to potentially attack. We have to recognize that our adversaries are not just looking for nation-state military impact, but they're also looking for economic impact. So when you think about solar winds and the downstream, down-chain impacts of that particular platform and that particular hack and breach, they're going to become more and more pervasive, more and more prevalent, especially as CJADC2 and ABMS get implemented out into a wider theater. And in doing so, the level of data, the amount of data is going to explode beyond anybody's expectations at this point. So I'm not even talking at storage levels. I'm not even talking about access. I'm not talking about API platform connectivity. I'm actually talking about just the sheer collection of that data and what that enables our adversaries to do and to think about, and the willingness that they will go to obtain any level of opportunity to access that data, both militaristically, nation-state impact, State Department impact, or even economic impact. So those are the three things that I think we really need to think about and address, both collectively from a Air Force to commercial, commercial to commercial, commercial to academia, Air Force to academia. Hopefully I've hit on all of those. But in every way, shape, and form, we need to think about those three particular elements, all circling back to the fact that we need more workforce. I heard in a session just today about AI. Everybody was talking about AI. And the big challenge right now is, are the AI algorithms correct? And what about data poisoning of the test data? If our adversaries are able to achieve any of that through and impact the ABMS elements or the CJADC2 elements that are engaged to support our fighters, it's game over. Reason being is that humans become too prevalent and too responsive to technology. And I'll share one quick story, and I'll pass this along, because I've probably taken up way too much time. We think about our phones, we think about the level of telemetry data and the amount of back-end systems that support our respective phones. I have a friend of mine who picked me up for dinner on Monday when I came out here, and he's directionally challenged. So Google Maps, Apple Maps have been a godsend to him. But as we're driving, one of the things that he realizes is that Google Maps is taking him, and not to pick on Google, but Google Maps is taking him in a completely off-center direction. And that off-center direction is causing him time and energy and getting him frustrated, because he can visually see the fact that the restaurant that we're trying to get to for dinner is right down the road, but there's nothing in between us. But Google Maps is insisting. So what does he do? He trusts Google Maps rather than trusting his own visual context, his own sensory context. One of the challenges that I would put forward, and kind of the final small elephant in the room, is that ABMS and CJADC2 have the opportunity to actually change up how our fighters and our guardians are thinking about and leveraging their own senses, and how much they are lacking trust potentially in that. So as part of this particular element, I would say that there's opportunity for academia to come in and help specifically with the Air Force around human interface, human study, time and motion studies as these items are being put forward. So thanks, and I'll pass it on.
All right, thank you.
Steve?
Yeah,
to you.
thank you, General Lyman. A little bit about my background, and I'll get to why I'm probably one of the few people on this stage that, has kids at home who don't trust their cameras on their computers and are freaking out their kids in class that, people are watching them. But that's a little bit of my background. So I spent the first 12 years of my career actually working in the intel community, working on systems that provide data to the warfighter at the edge. From there, I transitioned into systems that provide access, cyber access, to many of the capabilities that probably some folks in the room probably build today. So, and then I moved over into cyber defense. So currently, the portfolio that I help run, does Type 1 encryption, platform security, as well as space security. So really anything that I like to say lives in the gap between what commercial can offer from a cybersecurity standpoint and what the U.S. government may need for its most secure missions is what we focus on. When I think about, the question that's posed and how to drive competitive advantage, I go back to the situations in my career where we helped build something on an extremely short timeline, closing a mission gap or a capability that was needed in theater. And the reason I go to those is when I think of JADC2, I'm sure most people in the audience agree it's not going to be a big bang. Yeah, there's going to be a reference architecture and all that stuff, but it's going to be a series of gap closures, of data access, communication between systems, and there's going to be hundreds, if not thousands, of mini wins that have to be done on a rapid basis and then iteratively improve capability. And when I think of those times where we've done something on the order of months that have fundamentally changed how the warfighter is fought, I noticed a theme, and it was a theme sort of mentioned earlier, which was there was a co-investment approach between the company involved, in our case, General Dynamics, and the U.S. government. It wasn't something that necessarily ran through a long acquisition process, and I'll give you a few examples. So recently we were dealing with basically a data fusion issue at the tactical edge to intercept incoming threats to soldiers that are on the battlefield. And today's systems are trying to integrate data on the order of seconds because some of them are foreign systems that we're fusing data between and collecting from. Some are US systems. They're at different security levels. So you might imagine it has all of the challenges you hear at JADC2, foreign partner data at different security levels. And then in the middle of all this, you're dealing with, things like cross-domain guards that, are never structured to do things in real time. And so there we got together with the government and worked on optimizing and actually changing how guards work in this use case to drive to, orders of magnitude of improvement in how we share data across those security boundaries. And in this case, had to get guaranteed delivery of data on the order of milliseconds in order to do the computation to protect the warfighter. Another example is ongoing right now where it's a partnership related to the future of our space assets and security on those, where actually the U.S. government is, through contractual vehicles, is developing the hardware related to that security platform that will go on those, and we're developing the software. So we're co-investing with the government to then bring together a solution that will go on future space vehicles. So I probably have a whole slew of these that I can take you through. Some of them are done directly with the government. Some are done through nonprofit organizations that the government is reliant on. Some we've done through academia, actually. But I've found when we've moved the fastest, we've figured out ways to leverage co-investment of the company and the U.S. government at the same time. Everybody's got a stake in it, and we can really, really drive things much quicker. The other thing, and going back to that example about, where we were essentially intercepting incoming threats to the troops, one of the things I see as a constant pattern as we try to, move faster and make decisions faster are all these data silos and network silos that we have. So you see a lot about zero trust out there today. But, from my standpoint, I think back to, and I'm probably going to date myself here, PL4 type networks, right? Secret and above, all data on one network, data-centric protection around it, so that we're not dealing with, trying to transfer data between networks. We have one program where we have to, pull data from over 50 different networks together to help share and make decisions for the warfighter. And that's just, it's not going to scale to build a new network every time. And so I really think we got to get our head around this idea of collapsing the number of networks we have, moving to data-centric protection. Concepts like PL4 are not new. There's commercial capabilities out there on the market that help enable that. And I think we have to look at adopting those and really collapsing the disparate networks we have and driving that out to the tactical edge. So I think when I think of competitive advantage, I think of co-investment, and then on the network side, I think we got to really look at how we collapse the networks and make it easier to leverage data and do it in a way where, if tomorrow the warfighter needs to share data between these two entities for a new mission capability they're deploying, they're not having to pull new cable, they're not having to add new routers. It's just a configuration in the multi-level network. So those are my thoughts on sort of how to drive increased speed around JADC2.
Yeah, very good. Well, I'm encouraged by the fact that we have a whole slew of questions here from the audience. And so there's a whole theme around 5G. So Dan, maybe I'll pose this to you, and then if others want to weigh in. So a lot of questions about recognition in the last few years that 5G technology, a lot of it that's being fielded is made in China. That's being fielded domestically as well as internationally. So questions about recognizing that, how can we secure it, but also how can we, through policy and international relations, maybe work with foreign partners that have or are fielding those sort of foreign-built capabilities in order to have that secure environment we need. So really around security and that international environment with 5G. So love your thoughts.
Yeah, it's a great question. And clearly Huawei and a lot of the other Chinese manufacturers have been in the news. And at the subcomponent level down below that, even for those providers, the OEMs like Ericsson and Nokia, who provide a large part of the infrastructure, it's still a concern that the chip manufacturing, a lot of it is done overseas and so on. I think the CHIPS Act is a great example of how the U.S. government is addressing that, certainly supportive of trying to increase the amount of investment we're making in U.S.-based foundries and the ability to deliver more of the supply chain domestically. But to be honest, I think we're never going to get away from a global supply chain environment, and we're going to have to position to deal with that. Part of it is ensuring that we've got both the controls on the material and the personnel that enable delivery uncompromised of capabilities when they arrive into the higher levels of that supply chain. The good news, I think, is that there are numerous available partners in the open ecosystem for 5G that are either based in the U.S., have U.S. arms that are fairly robust in terms of both engineering, manufacturing, and delivery, or are located in allied nations. And I think when we think about the build out of a 5G infrastructure, we shouldn't think that there's no way to do this without buying higher level OEM equipment from Chinese manufacturers. I think there are ways to work within the existing ecosystem, especially as concepts like Open RAN, that's Small Cell Forum, and the Open RAN Alliance are progressing, that are creating a broader set of companies that can deliver specific capabilities for different parts of that infrastructure. Now that all being said, I think once the networks are up and operational, you've got a different set of challenges related to securing them. And the idea of a zero trust network and how do you do authentication on data through that entire network? How do you create the level of trust in the information that's being shared across, again, these heterogeneous networks that are going to be required? Because I do agree with Stephen, it's not going to be one network to rule them all. It's not going to be one, let's do a rip and replace and create one high side network that does everything for everybody. We're going to have to deal with the fact, the reality that the existing tactical, strategic, and enterprise networks, many of them are enduring and are going to be there for a while. And so we have to figure out the mechanisms for dealing with trust at those boundary conditions and finding ways to share information seamlessly among those networks in a way that meets the needs of the warfighter. So with that, I'm sure Lance has got
We
a lot
can't
to
talk
say.
about 5G without me jumping in. Dan knows that. Dan and I actually have these conversations every
Quite a
once in a while. So, you know, supply chain is critically important. And in a global mission with the Air Force and Space Force, you're going to encounter, especially outside the U.S., issues with supply chain, especially with host nation providers and things like that. We ensure our supply chain does not have those Chinese components in there. So that's an important part. We're a U.S.-based company. We take that role supporting the United States very seriously. And so policies that we put in place and policies that we try to project into the global telco and network service provider environment are key to how we try to position to ensure that you've got that clean supply chain. But like Dan said, you know, especially when you're operating globally, you'll see some more of that. Another way that we address that is maybe some of you have been to the AT&T Global Network Operations Center in New Jersey, and that's where we oversee at the top of the pyramid how we deliver our network. And so we carry about 450 petabytes a day on our network right now. We carry about a third of the world's internet traffic. And what we don't carry, because of our peering arrangements, we can see what everybody else is carrying as far as header information and that kind of stuff. And we've got amazing AI behind it. The platforms that aren't available on the open market we have to use to, that our labs develop to have the visibility we have. So we actually see down to the device level of the components for our network and understand the signatures because we work very closely. We're typically the #1 customer of most equipment manufacturers. So we have very intimate knowledge of how that equipment is developed and how it operates and how you can sense it. So we'll literally see signatures of devices getting ready to fail, and it alerts our trouble system, and we're able to proactively fix that. So when we have that kind of visibility, we're very aware of our supply chain, we're very aware of our infrastructure and what's in it and what might potentially turn into a problem.
Yeah, if I could just jump in and foot stomp something Dan said, actually. So I don't know how many people in the audience have tried to buy an FPGA recently, right? There's a global chip crisis, right? And that should make us all very concerned because, you know, a cyber attack against a chip manufacturer can literally bring the ability of the U.S. government to produce military equipment to a halt. And we're seeing a microcosm of that today in the shortage, right? There's FPGA lead times have gone from what you have historically been 12 weeks for certain ones out to 102 weeks or more. So you're talking about, you know, a huge delay in your program schedules and your ability to build those key military equipment. So, you know, I'm not saying I have a you know, panacea solution for it, but it is something that worries me, and it's something that I think we have to take very seriously from a national security standpoint.
And I would say that there are other aspects being delivered or being addressed through different channels around that. So academia and cyber manufacturing and our national labs have certainly teamed up and through DOE, the Cyber Manufacturing Infrastructure Initiative, or CYMAN 2 or CYMAN. Those are attempts to lay out new frameworks for advanced manufacturing, especially around 5G and other related systems from an ICS perspective in particular, to ensure that there are two key elements that are being addressed by it. One is energy consumption, trying to make certain that appropriate levels of lightweight encryption are being implemented through NIST, that particular effort, but then also looking for and finding and before actual silicon creation, implementing vulnerability changes and remediation efforts before it's put out to any sort of use. So there are elements being addressed, but they are specific to, again, U.S. and allied-based manufacturers.
Okay, Ed, let me start this question off with you. I think people are excited about the fact that we have academia represented here. So
thanks.
I got a number of questions here about controls on technology and personnel access. In academia, we have a lot of foreign partners that do research with DOD info. So a question about when basic research becomes applied research the protections around DOD info in that process and access to that. Any thoughts on the status of that and how maybe we can do better?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and I'm going to address it really with the emphasis towards. I believe that while basic research certainly is always going to have a place, what the trending has been more and more towards applied research. So how do we actually take a problem and apply it? Now, for the purposes of basic research, what I would say is that when we're utilizing any type of government relations, be it NSF, NIH, anybody, AFRL, for example, there's very clear delineation around the citizenship of the researchers involved. So, it's certainly dependent upon the academic institution. I'll give you a good example. Boise State has one of our faculty members working with AFRL specifically around some post-quantum encryption, impact analysis, and we're doing specific work there. The specific graduate assistance that certainly academia pulls towards itself is typically foreign nationals. But in this particular case, because of the relationship and the contract requirements, the graduate assistants that are working with this particular faculty member have to be vetted as U.S. citizens. They go through the same sort of checks, the same sort of perspectives that our own faculty members go through. So I can't speak for all of academia. I've only been in the space for a year, but what I can speak to is that Boise State takes this very seriously and makes certain that there are segregation of controls, citizenship checks, and background checks of our graduate assistants before they go and have any sort of work done. That is part of the challenge, I would say, if I'm being straight up and forthright around academia, is one of the challenges that we have is ensuring that there is this consistency of control applied so that we don't necessarily have any sort of exposure of IP or exposure of DOD secrets going and being leaked to a foreign national that isn't an ally or isn't in the sphere of acceptance.
Good.
If I could just add something to that,
Please.
I do think that industry and government can also help ensure that the researchers that are working on projects that are specifically looking at applied problems for our tough challenges, we do ensure that through the terms and conditions, either formally or informally, that we get the ability to review the staff that's going to be applied, that we have the ability to do security reviews on publications, without restricting the desire of universities to publish research work, even if it's funded by the government or by industry, to at least have that opportunity to review it and go through and provide feedback on things that should or shouldn't be disclosed in the open press. And then finally, I think one other thing that industry and government can do is extending our insider threat practices to also evaluate the team members that we have on our university research activities. And I know this is something that Lockheed Martin does to ensure that when we see red flags, those get addressed and we take the appropriate actions as we need to.
And I'm going to jump back in on one particular item there, and that is that I'm actually going to flip between two hats. The first hat I'm going to put on is my former industry and employer hat, and that is that what I've seen in academia is this shift and awareness towards the need for pure intellectual and data freedom so that any research is immediately publishable and immediately impactful, and personal brand development for the faculty members or the faculty teams is paramount. I've seen as an employer, and certainly I'll flip back on the Boise State hat and the academia hat, that there has been a shift. There's been a willingness to recognize, a huge degree of willingness to recognize the need to ensure that protection depending upon the specific partner or agency or funding source, that need for protection of key intellectual data and the right to publish simply goes in the back seat. So the intellectual freedom aspect that we've seen in academia, and certainly postulated by academia in certain spheres, is willing to be put to the back because of the need for this research.
Yeah, and I think the other thing is, we try to drive, as part of our qualification of which universities we're going to establish a master research agreement with. This is one of the things we specifically address with them, is their ability to bring on board U.S. citizen graduate students and their ability to segment the data, right? So using our own investment in partnering with these universities. And I'll tell you, honestly, there's been universities where we've wanted to partner with them because we see them as the world-class institution for something, but they just can't get over the hump of providing the type of graduate students that are needed to work it or guaranteeing the protections. And so we'll move to a different university, right? Obviously, there's multiple universities who can do the same thing, but it is one of the clear criteria we look for as we establish our master research agreements with these universities.
Steve, let me kick this one to you first. There's a couple of questions here about DOD's growing reliance on commercial networks, both overseas and commercially here in the United States. Recognizing DHS has the oversight for protection of commercial networks. What's the relationship like between the commercial industry, DHS here domestically, with regard to security, penetration testing, openness to having government protection teams have some insight there? And then if you've got some thoughts about relationships with foreign governments who may have the same challenge wherever DOD deploys, what do you think the status of that area is?
That is a great question, because I don't think I mentioned to you that, at one point in my career, I was actually working with what is now CISA, but was NPPD at the time, right? I think the system was known as the moniker Einstein, but it was actually the National Cyber Protection System, much more than the Einstein sensors. So, in terms of leveraging commercial networks, trying to just parse my words to make sure everything's sort of in the commercial domain here, right? That DHS has clear partnerships with some of the commercial providers on how to protect networks at places like the TICs and the Nest locations. In addition, Cyber Command has partnerships with DHS on how to execute missions to protect the homeland. So, from my standpoint, I think there's been a strong partnership. Obviously, there's always a little bit of give and take between some of the major ISPs and how, for example, how it demands where government data gets routed in their network so that it can be appropriately sensed, because you can't necessarily put sensors everywhere. But I know DHS is looking at how to revamp their approach to that, and especially as they look at the next phase of where that National Cyber Protection System goes. So.
Yeah, and if I can jump in on that too, and I agree that there's some very unique partnerships at the DHS and other levels with the commercial network providers, so I appreciate you bringing that up. I think there's sometimes a misunderstanding, though, about what the current DOD network is today. And DOD does not own most of its network. It's leased. And it's leased from the same commercial providers we're talking about. Unfortunately, it's not leased in a good way. And it defeats a lot of the cybersecurity and AI that's behind a true commercial offering and a managed network service that can be brought probably at a better cost point also than just doing leased circuits the way it's being done today. DOD is about the only organization that still does it that way in the markets. So it's already largely a commercial network. I think that the objective is, how do the commercial providers and DOD work together to ensure that the outcomes and the customizations perhaps that might be required on the DOD network can complement what the commercial provider also brings out of the box. And I probably won't surprise anybody saying this, but a lot of people in DOD are carrying mobile phones. That's totally a commercial network. We, in one effort not too long ago, we're working on a voicemail solution. And we're really getting a lot of scrutiny on how this voicemail solution would get put in. And I pulled my iPhone out and I said, every general officer in the Air Force is carrying this, and Apple's providing the voicemail. And I'm not picking on Apple. It could be Samsung, it could be Ericsson, it could be anybody who provides that. But I think that an honest discussion needs to have about what risk is already being accepted. And then what do they really, what's the true desired end state? And how do you start that starting line and that finish line? And how do we get, one thing that we often encounter is we have robust processes that we go through to ensure cybersecurity and assurances and things like that. And the starting line and finish line are often the same, NIST, and then be secure, be robust. But the path to get there is different. So that actually creates challenges in DOD when the vast market, we're going through one compliance process, but it's different for DOD. And so how do we maybe marry those up better as well? And I think that paperwork is painful sometimes, but it also ensures that we're on the same sheet together working through stuff.
Yeah,
Okay.
and if I could just add to that, right, you know, the ISPs have robust analytic capabilities for their network, you know, that they operate many of them operate worldwide SOCs, and so, you know, I encourage the government, and I think the government is looking at how to leverage that, right, rather than recreate the analytic infrastructure, but leverage what they have, and then also, you know, provide what is the difference between what the commercial SOC is offering and what they need to execute their mission.
Good. Thank you, guys. So we're out of time today, but I want to give a special thank you to our panelists today for a lively conversation, and one I hope will continue in many venues. And it's my pleasure, again, to have the honor of wrapping up AFA's Air, Space, and Cyber Conference. We hope you enjoyed the conference, and we look forward to seeing you again at future events. Thank you all.